Hello and welcome to today's Learn at Lunchtime Archaeology program from the State Museum of Pennsylvania. I am Beth Erickson. Today's topic is Where There's a Weir, There's a Way, Stonefish Weirs in Pennsylvania's Waterways. And with us is Melanie Mayhew, Archaeology Curator at the State Museum of Pennsylvania. Melanie assists in the care of collections representing more than 16,000 years of Pennsylvania's past. Her professional focus is to increase awareness, understanding, and interest in Pennsylvania's past and its role as a cultural crossroads. Welcome and thank you for presenting today's program.
Good afternoon. I'm glad to be here.
So let's get started.
In 2019, I began building an inventory of fish dams I identified using satellite imagery in Google Earth. Most of this work is focused on the Susquehanna River Basin, which contains approximately 49,000 miles of waterway and covers 27,500 miles of drainage area. Fish weirs are underwater stone walls that function as an efficient way of capturing fish. The weir shown here can be seen by thousands of people every day as they cross the Interstate 83 bridge traveling towards Harrisburg. It can only be seen when the river is very low, which is usually in September and October. It can actually be seen right now. There are several other weirs in this immediate area, but this one is the most obvious one by far. So I'm going to share some of my findings with you, but first I'm also going to give you some background information on the history of Pennsylvania's fisheries and its rivers. Pennsylvania has an incredible number of rivers, and they are generally divided into three major drainage basins within the state: the Delaware River Basin, the Susquehanna River Basin, and the Upper Ohio, Allegheny, and Monongahela River Basins, which are frequently referred to collectively as the Upper Ohio River Basin. This presentation will focus primarily on the Susquehanna River. Both the Susquehanna and Delaware eventually drain into the Atlantic Ocean, and they experience massive runs of migratory fish at different times of the year. The two fish that will be mentioned most in this presentation are the American shad and the American eel. The shad was of utmost importance to the early inhabitants of the region, and these fish migrated annually from the Atlantic to the coastal rivers to spawn each spring. Its Latin name, Alosa sapidissima, translates to most delicious, which speaks to its importance and high status. For contrast, another species of shad, the hickory shad, was given the name Alosa mediocre, or average shad. The quantity of fish that traveled upstream could be massive. In fact, it was said that you could hear the rumbling as they made their way upstream through the rocky landscape of the lower Susquehanna River. Their location could be seen by a wave that was created by their masses as they moved upriver in a concentrated stream of fish. The most common way of fishing for shad was by using a seine net. And this type of fishing was always a communal activity. Individuals sometimes determined their portion of a catch by the amount of knit that they knit. These nets were typically between 200 and 300 yards long, and it was a significant expenditure of energy and time and labor to create these nets. To give you an idea of the quantity of fish that were being caught, an 1825 record indicates that 1,500 shad were caught in a single haul, and some hauls were so large that it took upwards of 20 people working together to bring them to shore. Occasionally, the net was so laden with fish that it could not be hauled to shore, and a hole would have to be cut in it to release some of the fish. It does appear that weirs may have played a role in the shad fishing industry, although it is not entirely clear. The other fish we'll be talking about is the American eel. Unlike shad and other fish, the American eel migrates downstream in the fall to spawn in salt water. And then juvenile eels migrate up freshwater streams to live their lives. And they can live for decades. And it's for this reason that years after shad migration ceased, after the construction of hydroelectric dams, the eel migrations continued. Both of these fish were important sources of food, with shad arriving as the weather warmed and eel arriving as the weather cooled. The rivers were seen as an unlimited and free unlimited source of free and nutritious food by the early inhabitants, and significantly contributed to this area being such a favorable place for settlement. There are even accounts where they are advertising work and they say, "We have jobs for you, we have housing, and the river will provide your food." So the Susquehanna River is North America's longest non-commercially navigable river. This map, created by Benjamin Latrobe in 1801, illustrates the effect that dams have had on the river. Though this river did not undergo the same level of modifications as other large rivers, the river as we know it today is much different than it was before the arrival of European colonists. And later pollution and overfishing, and eventually the construction of large hydroelectric dams that cut off the passage of all migratory fish between the Atlantic Ocean and the Susquehanna River. The free passage of fish was recognized as an issue as early as 1686, when the inhabitants of Brandywine Creek, a tributary along the Delaware River, petitioned the provincial government to eliminate a structure that was blocking the passage of fish up that waterway. These inhabitants were the Lenape, who were being pushed westward. In 1700, the provincial government responded by passing an act prohibiting the use of racks and weirs that prevented the movement of fish upstreams. But they were not well enforced, and by 1735, the governor stated his desire that he should not be pressed further to consider a bill of this nature. It's around this time that there appears to be a shift from favoring the passage of fish upstream to favoring the transportation of goods by boat, for which weirs posed a significant hazard. So these weirs were being used by the indigenous communities that lived here before the arrival of the colonists. And when the colonists arrived, these weirs were seen as a very efficient way of catching fish, but they were too efficient, and they were very much overused by the colonists. And they would set up these racks that had very closely spaced bars that would essentially stop the passage of all fish. There were numerous other bills and acts passed over the years in an attempt to regulate the passage of fish on waterways, but they were kind of a piecemeal solution, and the enforcement was inconsistent until the creation of the Fish Commission in 1866. In some cases, residents ended up taking matters into their own hands to destroy dams that blocked the passage of fish. In historic annual reports of the Fish Commission, weirs are frequently listed as one of the most common fishing violations cited, alongside the use of spears and even dynamite. Weirs and other similar means of catching fish were outlawed in 1761, but the lack of consistent enforcement and the decline of fisheries led to the formation of the Fish Commission in 1866. Fish baskets were once again permitted in 1903, with additional measures being enacted in 1933, which branded them as eel shoots and established a licensing procedure and specific rules for their use. The licensing of eel shoots was ended in 2012, which is fairly recent. And it's from this period in the 20th century that we get these photos illustrating the method for constructing an eel chute. It's kind of interesting that some of the names that I've come across that were historically used to describe eels, some of these names include the noodle, the whip cracker, and whip snapper. So no doubt named for their long, slender body shape. And these walls would need to be rebuilt annually, and a heavy rain that caused river levels to rise could easily undo the hard work of building these walls and attaching the chute. During the 18th and 19th centuries, there were many disputes over who had the right to use a weir, with some ending in bloodshed and occasionally even death. So in these photos, you see them constructing the wall and then building the chute. And then in the middle picture on the lower row, you see they're actually raking the eels out of the chute. And this is something they would have to consistently work to keep that chute clear of leaves and branches and other debris. So my methods for identifying fish weirs started with using only Google Earth Pro. But once I began to incorporate some historic Farm Service Agency aerial imagery, which dates to the 1930s, the number of weirs I was able to identify nearly doubled. I also found it's possible to use GIS software to enhance the visibility and contrast of the river bottom, which are the images that you see here. This has improved my ability to identify weirs, and it seems like every time I look, I find additional weir locations. Weirs can appear in many different configurations, which may be indicators of when, how, or where they were built. These configurations can include single V, multiple V weirs, as well as stacked weirs where the tip of one weir touches the wall of another weir. There are also weirs that have been modified, such as the one on the lower left that was converted into a mill dam. There are also faintly visible clusters of weirs, as shown in the upper left image, and combinations of configurations, such as the fan-shaped arrangement of weirs and the middle of the top left. That multiple V weir image in the middle of the lower left is actually on the north branch of the Susquehanna River, and those are likely historic eel weirs. And I know that from historic documentation that talks about them being illegally constructed. And when eel chutes were allowed to be used again in the 20th century, they established certain areas where they could be used. And this cluster of weirs is actually at the northernmost extent of where those weirs were allowed. So it's kind of like everyone wanted to be first in line and built their weirs all clustered up right there together. So here's the same image of the weirs, but with them traced in red. And as you can see, some of these weir complexes are very extensive. There are also other atypical weir configurations. The leftmost configuration represents a historic fishery as indicated in an 1801 advertisement for the sale of an island with 2 associated fisheries. The second shows modification to an existing weir with the addition of a straight wall from the weir to the shore and the rounding of the lowest portion of the weir, which you can kind of see both the rounded tip and the V tip. And then you can also see where that wall used to extend straight up and out versus the higher portion that catches the ripples that is just traveling straight to the shore. There's also at least one J-shaped weir, which is shown in the rightmost image. From the archaeological record, we see the importance of fishing activities to the indigenous communities and the material remains that have been recovered from riverine sites. In addition to numerous fish bones found at sites, cordage, bone fish hooks, netting, basketry, and net sinkers have all been recovered from archaeological contexts. Net sinkers are a relatively common artifact type found along rivers and streams, and the image of the excavated pit containing a stack of net sinkers would have also contained the net to which they were attached. Making nets was an extremely labor-intensive activity, and even during historic times, great lengths were taken to try to preserve nets from one year to the next. They're not shown here, but there are actually post holes that surrounded this pit where a shelter may have been built to help protect this net. There are accounts from the upper Allegheny River that indigenous communities there were using weirs and brush net fishing to catch fish. Brush net fishing involves the driving of fish downstream towards a weir by dragging branches and hitting the water with them to drive the fish towards the dam where they could then be captured. And weirs continue to be used by indigenous communities in Oklahoma as an efficient method of catching fish. Clearly, fishing and weirs were and continue to be an important part of how these communities acquire food. So the cultural remains from historic fishing activities are actually less common than those from pre-contact sites. Here we see some wooden net floats and netting that were recovered from a York County site. And the image of these weirs was taken in 1937, and it clearly shows the openings where these eel chutes would have been attached to these weirs. The picture that's seen here dates the early part of the 1800s and was by a Philadelphia potter named Branch Green. And it shows a fish and berries motif. I guess there's been a lot of debate about what type of fish and berries are represented here. And I'd like to suggest that this may be shad and serviceberry. And the serviceberry was associated with shad because it was an indicator plant of when the shad would travel upstream. And the Delaware River did experience significant runs of shad, and even to this day, there are multiple shad festivals in the area. Another name for the serviceberry is actually the shad bush or shadberry that really shows its close association with the fish. So this map shows the weir locations that I've identified throughout the state. There's been nearly 400 to date. I'm thankful to members of the public who have over the years sent me weir locations that they've identified. The larger circles here represent locations with more weirs, while the smallest circles indicate locations with only one weir. It is interesting to note that there are some gaps in the distribution. The dams and other activities, such as clearing obstructions for lumber rafting or coal dredging, may have removed weirs from these areas. And it may have also been that, Harrisburg is very centrally located. And if you notice, some of those biggest weirs are not near Harrisburg. They're a little bit farther away. And so they may have been really kind of exploiting these weirs, but trying to do it not right under the nose of the government. So aerial imagery, as I mentioned, is really invaluable for identifying weirs. And the increased accessibility of aerial imagery has made it easier than ever to conduct these types of architecture surveys using remote sensing data. By comparing images over time, we can learn not only about the weirs and where they were located, but we can also learn about how the river has changed. Recent research indicates that the weirs contributed to the formation of islands in the river. And you can actually see that in this image. So this is actually just two images. The black and white image was taken in 1938, and this is a group of weirs below Shamokin Dam. And you can see how the islands change between 1938 and 2013. And you kind of see this throughout the river, where these islands, fluvial islands, come and go. But really, the weirs contributed to the formation of these islands by slowing down the water and letting sediment drop out of them and allowing them to be colonized by plants and other vegetation. Again, it's very difficult, if not impossible, to identify with certainty when these weirs were built, but sometimes we find clues to establish a minimum date through the use of historic documentation. So this large cluster of weirs is referred to in a newspaper article describing efforts of the sheriffs to destroy weirs during the second half of the 19th century through the formation of the Fish Commission. You see in newspapers, a lot of times it shows up these references of the sheriffs going out and destroying weirs, clearing these obstructions, talking about weirs that were illegally constructed. And so they talk about clearing the area between Shamokin to McKee's Half Falls to the south, and they describe resistance that was faced for a group of weirs near McKee's Half Falls, but they also mention that they expect resistance at the weirs below Shamokin Dam, which certain references this group of weirs shown here. So that definitely tells us that these weirs were in use during the historic time. So other less frequently used sources of documentation might be fine arts. And so this is a painting that's in the fine arts collections at the State Museum of Pennsylvania titled Wissahickon Creek. And it shows fish weir. It shows that the weir does not extend all the way across the water. It shows a semicircular weir, which are often associated with historic fisheries. There is a description of how fish were caught, and they would talk about driving them into a semicircular weir, which indicates that the weirs did play a role in shad fishing, even though maybe they weren't supposed to be using the weirs. So the existence of this weir that's semicircular, that there's a passageway for fish to travel upstream, that really places this temporally as a historic weir. And the painting was done in 1877, which would have been after the creation of the Fish Commission and when these laws were being enforced with some consistency. A lot of these paintings don't tell you exactly where they were taken, but it is possible to use some clues to figure out their location. So for this one, I wanted to figure out where on the Wissahickon Creek it was. So I looked at the mountains that were in the background. I looked at the flow direction. I looked at the light source, what time of year it was, to figure out what position the sun may have been in when this painting was done. And then I went to Google Earth Pro and I used their digital terrain models to and their aerial imagery to examine the Wissahickon Creek. Only part of that creek is surrounded by mountains, so that already limited the potential of where this image could have come from. And then I used the position of the sun and the direction of water to limit it down a little bit further. And then I used the digital terrain models to look at what mountains were in the background and really try to match up where this location is. And if you look in the lower left, this is the location that I found. And you can actually still see part of this weir today. And if you look in the painting, you can see a little bit of a walking path along the creek. And when I looked at the aerial imagery and the photo, there is that same walking path that is still there today. So another source of information can be the Canal map books that were created for the Pennsylvania Canal system that connected the eastern and western Pennsylvania before the construction of rail lines. And these were prepared in the first half of the 1800s. And these are in the collections of the Pennsylvania State Archive. And some of them show fish weirs. And there are maps for the Delaware River, Susquehanna River, the Juniata River, which is surprising. It doesn't show any weirs on it. And then it also has ones for some of the rivers in western Pennsylvania, like the Monongahela. So the Delaware continues to be the longest free-flowing river in North America, and it continues to experience migratory fish runs. Navigation improvements dredged out the lower portion of that river, which makes it, you're not going to find those weirs there, which is a shame because there's actually another type of imagery called bathymetric LiDAR that really in detail maps the river bottom, but it's usually just used for mapping navigation channels. And so where it does exist on the Delaware River, it's unfortunately not very helpful because it's only mapping those areas that have been dredged. And the Susquehanna River did have a lot of efforts to remove these weirs. This one is actually in the lower Susquehanna River. And then also in the Monongahela River, you see these sort of chutes. And these were wing walls, they're often called, that would help channelize the river and direct the flow of water over rapids to improve navigation. The location of these wing walls is generally in the same places where you would find fish weirs. So it's difficult to say if these may have been fish weirs that were then converted to wing walls to improve navigation. There are records of that type of activity occurring on the Susquehanna River at around the same time as the development of the Pennsylvania Canal system. And so I went looking for these locations in the rivers and I found them. And it's really useful information because there are a lot of areas that I come across where these weirs are not very clearly defined. It looks like there may be a hint of a V-shaped structure, but it's so faint that it's really difficult to tell. But by being able to match up this historic imagery with the modern imagery, it helps to confirm that yes, even if they are faint, these are weirs. And you still see, even on the Monongahela, you still see some of the remnants of that wing wall that existed. So I've been fortunate enough to have the opportunity to make a couple of site visits. And this one's from an area below York Haven Dam, which was built in 1904. This was the first of 4 hydroelectric dams to be completed on the Susquehanna River. The construction of Holtwood, or at the time it was called McCall's Ferry Dam in 1910, that one just really completely cut off the flow of all shad. This one had cut it off above this point, but the construction of Boltwood Dam really was kind of like the last nail in the coffin for the shad fishing industry. This image is particularly interesting because it shows up to 3 different types of adjacent fisheries. After all, there's more than one way to catch a fish. It's within this area to the left that you see this low flat area that historic records indicate as shad pools. And there's a newspaper article that I found that talks about a dam being built between the trees that you see in the background are an island. So there is another channel on the other side of that land between the island and the shore. And there was a dam that was built on that channel that prevented the movement of boats up that way. And so all the boats were then going around the west side of the island here and really disrupting the shad fishing activities of the island's proprietor. And so it was really neat to see that there are these very cleared areas where there's not very many rocks or anything there. There are also weirs in the area, which you can see on the inset image in the lower left. But these are actually very difficult to identify when you're on the ground, because as you can see, the landscape is just incredibly rocky. And if I hadn't identified these weirs before going out to this site, it really would have been easy for me to overlook them. Another type of fishery was bow net or dip net fisheries. So you see that fishing rock, and those types of fisheries were essentially just large rocks in the river, and people would stand on them and use a large net to scoop fish out of the river. And this would typically occur in turbulent waters because shad are a very skittish fish. They're not going to go towards something where they know they're going to be captured. And so these would be in areas where the water was really turbulent and that visibility was low. Here's another weir that I visited. This one is near New Cumberland. Again, the weir itself is, I tried taking some underwater imagery using a GoPro, but it really just looks kind of like stacks of rock. Like the wall is not very well defined. It's probably because, I mean, these weirs have not been rebuilt in decades, or maybe even more than 100 years. So, but they are still there, and they do still catch these ripples. So they're visible from above the surface. And this weir in particular is very interesting because one of the wing walls used a natural rock outcrop to help channel the fish. So they were using natural features of the river. Why do more work when you can use what's there naturally? So I haven't mentioned it before, but there have been significant efforts to help migratory fish return to the river through the use of fish ladders, transporting them by truck, and creating improved fishways around dams. And the data, like I've collected in weir locations, does have the potential to help inform restoration efforts by indicating areas that were historically good fishing grounds. And when I've made visits out to weirs, there are very often boats pulled up right below these dams fishing. And this project has just really given me a much deeper appreciation for the importance of our rivers and the role they played for the regions and early inhabitants. So in conclusion, where there's a weir, there's a way to catch a fish, to learn about the past, to inform restoration efforts, to understand changes in the rivers, to involve the public, and to reconnect with our water. Thank you.
Thank you, Melanie. That was very interesting. Let's get to some questions. How do you distinguish between Native American weirs versus historic weirs?
That is really, really difficult. And I'm not sure that it's possible to do that because the weirs that were used in a historic context may very well have been reused Indigenous weirs. There are some cases where it's easier to determine which weirs were used historically, like those ones that clearly showed the eel chute, the openings at the ends for the eel chutes. Another indicator for which weirs may have been indigenous are their association to known settlement locations and archaeological sites.
Were there any structures identified on the Schuylkill River or its tributaries?
I believe that there have been some on the Schuylkill River. They definitely were there. One of the issues I come across, though, is in using aerial imagery, is that if the waterway is too narrow, then trees are going to block the view. It's just not going to be very visible. So my data is definitely biased towards the larger waterways in the state.
Are there differences in weirs found in the upper Ohio basin in quality or quantity?
There were so many navigation improvements that happened on that river at such an early date that I really don't have a good record of what was there. And, if you look now, the locks and dams, like really just the navigation improvements make finding weirs on those waterways very difficult. So, and I haven't found the historic records that indicate where those weirs were located. And honestly, I have not spent as much time looking on those waterways as I have for the Susquehanna.
In the at the Weir sites, is there a concentration of fish weights in the area, or what other artifacts would be found that are associated with weirs?
That's a tough one to say because I have looked a little bit at the association of where these net sinkers occur and where the weirs were, but it's not always a direct association. More often, it's just the existence of significant settlements in the vicinity of weirs. And I mean, there are also, the weirs are all over the Susquehanna River. So I had tried doing some looking at the associated archaeological sites and their chronology within a certain distance of these weirs. But there are just so many weirs that my results weren't very meaningful because it was just essentially telling me what types of sites were near rivers.
Are there any colonist accounts of Native American weir practices? And if so, what sources are there?
So there are ethnographic accounts. I don't have the references on hand, so I'd have to get back to you about that. But I know that there were some Moravian missionaries who described the use of weirs. And there's also the reference of that petition to the provincial government by the Lenape on Brandywine Creek in 1686. So we know that there were weirs there. But yeah, it's kind of, they're spotty, those references. But they are there. I know that another one is Fenton, but I would have to look to get a list of those together.
Do weirs appear in other areas of North America or in the world?
Yes, they appear all over the world. There are a large concentration in the eastern woodlands in the eastern United States from about northern Georgia up into New York. And it's been really neat that I've had an opportunity to talk to some of the other people who are doing the same type of research and looking at weirs. And I think from what we found, it looks like the largest concentrations of weirs appear in North Carolina and in Pennsylvania. But a lot of those other states, those rivers experience such significant improvements for navigation that they're only finding a portion of what was there.
Is there a similar distribution of weirs in the upper Susquehanna Valley?
Yeah, they kind of continue up. There are a lot. There are a lot of weirs. There's just a lot.
Can you tell us more about the earliest dams and how many dams are there currently?
So the earliest dams in Pennsylvania, the Army Corps of Engineers maintains a national inventory of dams, And the earliest dam that it records for Pennsylvania is actually 1748. And Pennsylvania indicates that there are over 3,000 state regulated dams. And so it seems like every 50 years, from what I found, the number of dams appears to have quadrupled. So, starting out with fewer than 100 dams, maybe in, like 1800, but then it's like, it just explodes, really, as you go through the 19th and 20th centuries.
Are drone surveys of streams being performed during low water events that would help identify weirs?
Drone surveys would be extremely useful, and they are being used, I know, by a professor at Susquehanna University who has been researching fish weirs and their effect on the formation of islands in the river. So there are some concentrated efforts to survey with drone, but there is no unified, like, large scale survey of the river. But if people want to go out and do these drone surveys and let me know what they're finding, I would love that.
Well, this leads into the next question. What areas are there that have not yet been surveyed?
So since most of my work has focused on the Susquehanna River Basin, and it's used aerial imagery with really limited opportunities to go out and visit these locations, pretty much all of the small streams and rivers are still unsurveyed. And also the Delaware River, I've not spent as much time surveying that, even though we know that there were extensive fishing activities on that.
Below the Conowingo Dam, there seems to be remnants of a weir. Is that something you're familiar with?
I'm not familiar with that location, but I would expect it.
The question is, there's petroglyphs in the area, and is there a correlation between petroglyphs and fish weirs?
So I've looked for that, and I don't know if it's just because of the effect that the water impoundment has behind the dam, but I've not really been able to identify any weirs that are directly associated with the petroglyphs. Occasionally, I do find some other river features that are not fish weirs that may indicate that there was a ford, and it does look like there may have been a ford across the river near where the petroglyphs were that is visible through aerial imagery, but it's only visible in a set of aerial imagery that was taken during a drawdown of Lake Aldred.
Is there a limit on stream size and weir distribution? For example, are there fewer weirs in the Susquehanna in New York versus Pennsylvania due to channel size?
The channel size does affect it. I think it also depends on the size of the channel. So in the Susquehanna, you see a lot of these multiple V weirs, these really large weir complexes. When you get onto the creeks and some of the smaller rivers, like the Juniata River, they're almost exclusively like single V weirs. So you do see fewer of them, but it's, there are factors that I'm sure that I've not yet identified for these.
And you may have mentioned this, but if you could tell us again, what is the origin of the name Weir?
That I do not know.
Oh, okay. We stumped you. All right, well, that's a good one for us to see if we can figure out a little more. There's a lot of interest in this. So what can the public do to assist in this effort?
So, I mean, going out and walking along these smaller streams where aerial imagery can't identify weirs, taking drones out and getting drone imagery. Little things like that. I've had several people send me their Google Earth data sets with the weir locations that they've identified. And in just about every case, there's weirs that I missed. It's just really difficult to identify all of these weirs. After going over the same area multiple times, occasionally I still find another one.
Thank you, everyone, for your questions. Melanie, what would you like the audience to remember from today's presentation?
I just want you to remember that the river that we see today is much different than what it used to be. And that weirs are there, and they're a way to reconnect with the past and with our waterways.
Thank you so much for today's presentation.
Thank you.
Please join us again for more Learn at Lunchtime programs. Visit the State Museum of Pennsylvania's website at statemuseumpa.org for program information and to sign up.